Welcome back, dear ladies and gentlemen. Again, my name is Vincent Emmanuel Herr. I'm the moderator of the Track 2 discussions today. This is also your reminder, if you're hearing me, then you're part of Track 2. If you sign up or interested in listening into Track 1 instead, feel free to switch over. At this point, there should be a button at the bottom of or right beneath your live stream window. Before the break, here in Track 2, we took a look at current challenges regarding a governance framework for agricultural data. With the second session right now, we will want to expand on these points made previously and take what we would like to call a deep dive. Before I introduce our speakers, reminders for you in the audience, you will be able to directly pose questions to the speakers and experts. Just use the chat box right to the right of your screen and enter a question there. Please include, if you want to, please include your name and institution as well as which speaker your question is addressed to. You can already enter questions during the whole session, not just during the Q&A slots, but also previously, so we can get started right away. With that being said, let me introduce the experts and speakers for this second session. We have Dr. Katarzyna Kozioła. She's from the Institute of Agricultural and Food Economics at the National Research Institute in Warsaw, Poland. We also have Dr. Alexander Duisberg, from the international law firm Bird & Bird, LLP. We have Can Attic from Tilburg University, and more specifically from Tilburg Law School in the Netherlands. We have Dr. Martina Anzini from the Center of European Policy in Freiburg, Germany. And we have Bernd Rauch from Fraunhofer Institute for Experimental Software Engineering, IESE. Both Martina Anzini and Bernd Rauch will give presentations as speakers. They will also come in to moderate the Q&A sessions and put questions into context if need be. Each speaker will present for 15 minutes. Again, I'd like to ask all speakers to try to stick with that time frame. We will remind speakers via direct comment, direct message, direct chat once they only have 2 minutes left. And if need be, I will just briefly do an audible signal if you're going over time. With that being said, let's start with our first speaker, Dr. Katarzyna Kozioła. She's researcher at the Institute of Agricultural Food Economics at the National Research Institute in Warsaw, Poland. Her input this afternoon is entitled Agricultural Data, Diversity of Players, Data Relations, and Data Categories. Thank you so much for being with us, Katarzyna. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. The president of the European Agriculture Machinery Association expressed the opinion that the companies such as Google could have so much agricultural data at its disposal that the company with that amount of data could farm more effectively than 70% of current farmers. These words reflect concerns over who collects agriculture data, who uses data, who has access to data, and who benefits from agriculture data. On the other hand, we have also concerns about barriers to digitalization and innovation in agriculture. Elliot Grant from X company, subsidiary of Google's parent Alphabet, stressed recently that while many farmers use digital tools, many farmers say that these new streams of data are either overwhelming or don't measure up to the complexity of agriculture. Therefore, farmers differ back to things like tradition, instinct, or habit. And for these reasons, the industry remains one of the least digitized. We can therefore see that there are many different perspectives and problems related to agriculture data and data relations. And the aim of my presentation is to provide a short overview of some of these problems and also to put forward arguments justifying the need for specific provisions on agriculture data and specific treatment of European agriculture data space. These arguments can be roughly summarized in 3 key points. The first point is that agriculture, the digital data value chain in agriculture is one of the most complex and problem-laden data value chains in the emerging digital economy. The second point is that current data relations between farmers and technology providers and between the public and the private sector do not allow for unlocking the full potential of agriculture data. And When considering a data governance framework for digital agriculture, one has to take into account the fact that digital agriculture, data-driven agriculture, builds on different categories of data, which are currently governed by different EU legal regimes. We can enumerate machine-generated data, public sector data, open data, sensor data, non-personal data, personal data, and many other. And although we can enumerate these different categories of data, it is not always possible to draw a definitive line between some of these categories in specific economic situations. And it is particularly true in the case of agriculture, where boundaries, for example, between machine data and production data, non-personal data and personal data, raw and aggregated data are often blurred and contested. General data rights and obligations relevant for the processing of agricultural data have been set out in the horizontal regulations, but these regulations do not provide a clear definition of rights and obligations in relation to farm data, producer field level data, and as a result, there are still gaps in the protection of farmers' interests, and there are also sector-specific constraints and deficiencies in the agricultural data value chain that are not addressed by the current regulatory framework. And specific provisions on agricultural data would be badly needed because the scale of power imbalances in the digital value chain in agriculture is greater than in other sectors and industries. This, to a certain point, is a consequence of unequal distribution of power in the traditional agri-food chain. Generally, farmers have less market and bargaining power in relations with input suppliers, technology companies, processors, and others. And the digital value chain, starting from data generation till data usage, that is data monetization, is even more complex because it engages a greater number of actors, businesses, and organizations with differentiated interests. Generally, one can see a growing interest in agriculture data also from those players that have not been so far linked to agriculture or agriculture activities. The largest companies aggregating agriculture data dominate in the chain and benefit disproportionately more than other stakeholders, particularly farmers. Farmers provide data to technology companies and pay for the access to digital products and services, but have little or no control over data flows and over data monetization strategies used by data aggregators. And as a result, there is a lot of uncertainty in relation to the aims to which individual and aggregated agriculture data could be used, and farmers may have many concerns in this respect. The most important consequence is that these imbalanced data relations affect the use of agriculture data and seem to slow down digitalization and innovation in agriculture. The problems are the lack of transparency and trust in smart farming systems, but also practices that limit access to data, limit data portability and data sharing. Some factors that contribute to these problems have already been extensively analyzed by researchers in the field. Basically, data relations in digital agriculture are governed by private contractual agreements that are quite complex and non-transparent and rather add to many farmers' concerns. For example, the concerns of data uses that may harm farmers' interests, but also concerns over potential privacy breaches. Other important concerns relate to data concentration and lock-in effects. The largest companies have enough resources and data to offer complementary data products, digital products and services in complete packages with adjusted subscription fees. In addition, companies use different data formats and different technical and quality standards, which also limits access to data, limits data portability and the reuse of agricultural data. These problems highlight the importance of specific principles and rules. And although there is no single list of such principles and rules, it is widely believed that more balanced data relations in digital agriculture require data transparency, data ownership or data sovereignty, data privacy, data security, data portability, data sharing, data interoperability, and data quality. This is a quite long list, but still incomplete if we want to create a more comprehensive data governance framework for digital agriculture. Such more comprehensive data governance framework should also take into account other sector-specific constraints and deficiencies in the agriculture data value chain, namely asymmetries in data production and use, the fact that farmers work with natural systems and are limited by time and other factors, also a higher need to integrate Internet of Things sensor data with farmers' knowledge and experience, and also insufficient links to sustainability goals and social good. As for asymmetries in agriculture data production and use, we have to remember that digital transformation in agriculture is more difficult and slower than in other economic sectors, and among fundamental reasons are gaps in broadband connectivity in rural areas, but also social, economic, and financial constraints. Although information on the uptake of digital technologies by EU farmers is scarce, considerable differences between individual countries, regions, farms may be expected. The research shows that the larger the farm, the greater the adoption potential. One can therefore expect that the current digital value chain in agriculture is powered up mainly by data from large and very large farms. A negative externality of such data flows is that they do not reflect the diversity of European farming systems. Because of economies of scale and higher costs of collecting and analyzing data from smaller and more diversified farms, the market alone will continue to favor data sets from larger and more specialized farms. There are concerns that these asymmetries will increase income inequalities in agriculture and negatively affect sustainability and the European model of agriculture. Increasing income gaps may result in further land and production concentration, but also the lack of adequate digital tools for smaller farms means that it would be more difficult for these farms to reduce their environmental impact. Therefore, it would be important for the future agriculture data space to provide for data diversity, not only in terms of diverse categories of data included, but also in terms of diverse categories of farms represented in the digital value chain. But other important problems relate to the fact that farmers work with natural systems under various and changing climate and environmental conditions, and this open and dynamic setting has to be contrasted with closed and more controllable environments in other industries. Generation of data inputs in agriculture depends on natural production cycle and is extended in time. It cannot be programmed or speeded up, like, for example, in manufacturing. And longer time needed to produce data and slower pace of digitalization in agriculture implies slower growth of data volumes needed to train data models. In such settings, data-based products and predictions in agriculture may be less accurate and less reliable, particularly for smaller farms and new entrants with no historical data records. In addition, given diversity of production methods and specific production conditions and outcomes within different European farming systems, remote sensing data may be not enough to provide adequate decision support systems for farmers. Research shows that digital tools in farming require a greater amount of human source data and human advice, both to better understand farmers' needs and to include additional insights about local farming practices. It seems that these requirements for data integration are greater in agriculture than in other industries. But the most fundamental problem with the current digital value chain in agriculture is that there is no clear commitment to sustainability and to sharing agriculture data for social good. The digital value chain is dominated by corporate interests, and the business narrative associates agriculture data with such values as optimization of efficiency, maximum yields, profitability. Sustainability appears only as a potential side effect and not a major goal of data-driven innovations. Also, the EU Code of Conduct does not include a reference to sustainability. Principles and guidelines are focused on private relations and do not provide hints as for the aims of agricultural data analysis. But deficiencies still also exist at the level of relations between the public and private sector. Currently, there are no governance structures that would allow for greater business to government data sharing for public interest. And this is a dead weight loss because the aggregated agricultural data sets could support scaling up sustainable farming practices and delivering European public goods, the goals foreseen in the European Green Deal and all related strategies. And as the recent research consultations with stakeholders show, there's a growing expectations that social values will be part of smart farming systems. In other words, that data collection, data use, and data sharing will be more socially responsible. Coming to conclusion, this short overview shows that there are many problems and sector-specific constraints, and it seems that some of these problems would be best dealt with sectoral provisions, sectoral regulations. At the same time, further discussions are needed concerning the rules and principles for the European agriculture data space. These principles should be linked to European values and also they should take into account broader social functions of agriculture data. In other words, we need principles that would empower farmers in the digital value chain and increase access to data, data portability and data sharing, the issues that will be discussed in the next presentations. But we also need more specific rules that would take into account the needs of the whole sector and its special role in the economy and society. More balanced and value-driven data relations also require data diversity, data integration between machine data and human knowledge, human experience, human source data, and the data responsibility to support the use of data for sustainability and social good. Thank you very much for your attention.
Katarzyna, thank you so much for this good overview, very detailed overview. I think we all really appreciate that. Thank you. We'll be continuing with our second input for this session. It will come from Dr. Alexander Duisberg. He's lawyer and partner of the international law firm Bird & Bird LLP. He will speak on the legal strategies to establish a well-ordered agricultural data space. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours. I think you might have to unmute yourself. I can see your presentation. Just hit the unmute button. Yeah,
here I am. Thank you so much, Vincent. Yes, welcome, and thank you so much, Katarzyna, also for your great introductory presentation. I think it's laid the tone and set the scene for what I wanted to share with you in a quarter of an hour. I'm a practicing lawyer for over 20 years, and I happen to be now for the last 4 years also member of the steering group of the International Data Spaces Association, which has been created in Germany, which is looking at certain frameworks to generate or develop data spaces. And I'm pleased to share some of the learnings and thinkings from there with you in this quarter of an hour to maybe build on what Katarzyna has said. She spoke about the types and quality and requirements on data, and I will try to show a little bit on the, let's say, framework in which this could be embedded. And I do share her views on some of the deficiencies that she has noted. Just to recap, and also from a lawyer's perspective, of course, we are obviously in a framework where the EU Commission has envisioned a strategy for data just earlier this year, in which the requirements on a governance framework have been made very articulate, and the intent to address specific sectors explicitly exclude the agricultural sector, which may have been mentioned earlier today, but it is very comforting and reinforcing that this is something that is high on the agenda, and we do understand why. And what I want to share with you as some of the requirements that come out of this is obviously the need for sharing and also creating a policy framework for pooling agricultural data. And there is a common and a wider benefit, as has been articulated already before, in making that happen. And also the market inequality between the large technology providers, other stakeholders, the issue of public data, and the farmers who may have a less balanced position in the market is critical. But I can also tell you from some experience also in this field that farmers, at least in some places like in Germany, are also very conscious of the issues. So it is something where a joint effort and also some persuasiveness is required in making this happen, but also incentives. So issues around data monetization and who actually gets a share in the piece of the cake is very relevant in this context. There is further guidance on which I will not speak, but just make the reference as you see there. In terms of the IDS, the International Data Spaces Association, very briefly on the institutional background, it has been created in Germany as an offspring or a side stream of the wider stakeholder initiative Platform Industry 4.0, looking at digitalization of certain sectors, obviously starting with the industry, but now also reaching out into other sectors. The IDS or the IDSA is now a truly international initiative with a very strong buy-in and participation of many non-German other initiatives. It is also an integral part of Gaia X, which I believe many of you are acquainted with, at least of the recent past, to create an open but European-driven platform of platforms, possibly, to bring together and to build a European federated data infrastructure for European ecosystems. So just to put that into perspective, the IDSA plays a very important role in this context, and I will use that as the lead for some of the thoughts that have come out of this initiative. This is a visualization of, if you like, the Industry 4.0, so ultimately more smart manufacturing ambience, but it is to show you that the structural approach to this always considers the ecosystem of data providers and data consumers and a connector technology, which is one of the core elements of the IDSA. A connector technology which was originally created by Fraunhofer Gesellschaft in Germany to bring together, to connect data from different sources to actually make them operable and interoperable, which is one of the very relevant constituent elements. But it is not limited to that. I think one of the key aspects of creating a data space is reflected in various components. One of the key aspects is a reference architecture model that has been laid out by the working groups of the IDSA, which helps actually build the semantics and bring together a common nomenclature for actually transacting in data and also defining the further going requirements on data. So some of the things that Katarina mentioned in her talk about how to actually make it work are very much also connected to the question of, are you able to create a reference architecture? Is there a reference architecture available that can bring these sources together, that can facilitate data exchange? And just to show you some of those sub-elements of the existing architecture of the IDS, it's a business architecture, it's a data and services architecture. It does also set requirements on software architecture and security. So some key elements that are relevant for any kind of data space. I already briefly mentioned the IDS connector, which is a central technical component which allows for the secure data exchange and data sharing. And I should say the concept of the IDS in this sense is that data sets would be vested with certain attributes which allow to communicate with other data sets, to recognize each other, and ultimately also to attach certain usage terms So ultimately, contractual terms to communicate and define usage rights, including usage control, where the usage rights should end. A further element of the data space is certification. It is very important that the participants in a data space who are offering services, who are facilitating the usage of data services such as data brokers, are certified against a standard. And in that context, the IDS has done great work in developing the IDS readiness and the IDS standard against which certifications can be effected. And this has been created over the last couple of years, and it is, if you like, ready to go. From a legal perspective, and this is obviously very close to what I do, not only within the IDS, but beyond, and Katarina mentioned this, the principles of data sovereignty are not predefined by a pre-existing ownership in data. This does not exist, and I have been part of very long consultations and discussions in various fora, including the EU Commission. I think it is now common sense that there is no value or prevalent value in defining a civil ownership in data as such. It is all about contracts, but to pay fairness to what Katarina said, it is very important that those contracts are also fair and balanced and do not create market distortion from the outset. And in that sense, it is certainly important to have a grasp and general feeling of what contracts could look like. And I've used this chart here to show you that there are obviously different types of contracts to consider. And we've developed this type of matrix within the IDS. I've also shared it at the EU Commission level and other occasions to show it is important to create not only a reference architecture, not only a technology, not only a certification, but also sample contracts or basic ideas about how data sharing can be effected. And I can only underpin, this is obviously very important role for lawyers, for all who are legal practitioners, to develop that community, to develop standards and common learnings of useful template agreements. What is at heart of these agreements, very briefly, is that you do have a data provider who would be something like a data licensor and a data consumer. And in order to make that work, and it could be a data licensing one-to-one or one-to-many, a few fundamental considerations. Is it making data available for free or against a payment? Is it a counter a payment? Is it a consideration against other data? All these considerations are very important from the outset, and they have to play out in a data space. And there are obviously there's not one size fit for all. It can all fit into a wider data space where the parties actually find their co-partners in making this work. Obviously, then there are further legal considerations on the quality of the data and related warranties. There's the issue of risk. There's the issue of compliance. There are, on the consumer side, the limitations of usage, the exploitation, using data for AI training. Fair use rights need to be discussed, most likely in the agriculture sector in particular, whereas the common good of facilitating and solving nutrition issues, not only in Europe, but more widely, and issues of onward licensing and so forth. So you can see a whole array of issues, including then the wider considerations on security, database rights, and issues on data provenance more generally. I just want to share with you in this brief period some learnings or examples from which we can learn. And this one comes from the maritime industry, where I share in the Netherlands has set up a consorted data sharing platform. And we have also been looking at the IDS into the terms and conditions and the approach that has been taken there, and it shows to be very successful. Now, obviously, the Port of Rotterdam is a rather confined area, and the number of players involved are also overall rather limited, but still it shows that a consorted effort can help develop an ecosystem which works well. And the overall approach is to create low entry barriers for data sharing and to facilitate new forms of collaboration. And indeed, some of that also depends on predefined data, access terms, terms of use, and certain forms of defining data sharing. which is a good example. And the IDS has actually been participating in the, let's say, know-how exchange and also inviting iShare to contribute to the IDS. Beyond that, I would also like to share an example, which I think is also very impressive, but it does show also the more corporate approach, where we as advisors also been involved in the past in looking at some elements of this ecosystem where you have a large ERP provider, enterprise research program platform provider, who is making available a platform and then combining different data sources, different data providers to create services. And it can also be an open platform which defines along a connected agriculture architecture certain elements and sub-elements. And you can think about a lot of appliances that work this way. If those platforms are open and based on fair terms, they can also work well. But it is clear that there is always a certain corporate bias and interest behind which needs to be looked at, which can also be looked at certainly from market and also antitrust perspectives, which those providers are also aware of. It does, however, show that there might be certain limitations in this model, in particular also in terms of user acceptance, which we have seen to be an issue also in other contexts, where in particular farmers may take a very reserved stance in being locked into a particular ecosystem. So the issue of data portability has a huge role. It is derived from two legal reference frameworks. One is the GDPR, and the other is also the free float of non-personal data, which I think deserves greater emphasis in this very given context as well. So with that, I'd like to conclude. So I think there is a very, very high demand for data spaces, a data space or several data spaces in the agricultural ambience. I think it is very important to consider a confederated approach. This doesn't mean to restrictive regulation, but it means creating frameworks as available opportunities which have a reference architecture, provide for certifications, template contracts, and also think about security. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much. And I'm available for any questions and would like to hand back over to Vincent. Thank you.
Wonderful. Alexander, thank you for giving your presentation, this very insightful, I guess, perspective on the legal questions of this of the questions that we are talking about here today. We will definitely have questions for you during our Q&A. So not to worry on that side. We'll continue before we get to our first Q&A with one more speaker. Our next input will come from Dr. Martina Anzini. She's legal policy analyst at the Department of Financial Markets and Information Technology of the Center of European Policy. Her talk's title will be Promoting Data Sharing in the EU. Thank you for sharing your insights with us, Martina. The floor is yours.
There we go. So, perfect. Can you see my slides?
It looks good. Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. My presentation, the title of my presentation is Promoting Data Sharing in the EU, Regulatory and Antitrust Perspective. It has the following objectives. So first of all, it aims at illustrating the latest initiatives undertaken by the Commission in promoting data share, business-to-business data sharing within the EU. And secondly, it aims at highlighting that the legal uncertainties surrounding the antitrust treatment of data exchanges could make those efforts certainly not useless, but insufficient. So I would like to start by outlining the big project or the vision that the Commission has for the digital single market, that is the establishment of a European data space, and how insufficient data sharing endangers its accomplishment. I would then move on to illustrate the strategy that the Commission has undertaken to facilitate business-to-business data sharing. One of the pillars of the above strategy is the promotion of the data sharing intermediaries model, which has been set forth in the recently published proposal for a Data Governance Act. Then I would go to the bulk of my presentation, which has to do with problematic interactions between the data sharing intermediaries model and competition law. I will conclude by formulating 2 recommendations. So the Commission has a vision for the digital single market. That is the establishment of a European data space, which it describes as a genuine single market for data where businesses can access an almost infinite amount of high quality industrial data. This is, of course, the broad vision, which needs to be made concrete and adapted to the specific economic sectors through the establishment of sectoral data spaces. The Commission has already identified a number of sectors which are of strategic importance, and the agricultural sector is among them. So why is business-to-business data sharing insufficient in the EU? There's a lot of reasons for that. I would like to mention the fact that parties to a data exchange lack trust as to the fact that their counterparty will actually comply with the contracts they sign. The huge differences in negotiating power between the participants, the fear that some data holders have that third parties might use data in a way they never agreed upon, and the legal uncertainty surrounding the use of certain data, and so who can use them and in which terms. This is particularly the case for co-created data. I would say that the strategy that the Commission is pursuing to facilitate business-to-business data sharing is twofold. On the one hand, we have the Commission set forth a proposal for a harmonized framework for data sharing intermediaries in its proposed Regulation for a Governance Act published last week. How is that? How can it be that a harmonized framework for data sharing intermediaries can promote business-to-business data sharing? There is hope that given the fact that there is an EU regulatory framework, a EU harmonized framework, data holders might trust this business model a bit more and might decide to put their data to use. At the same time, this enables this business model to fly by making it easy to go cross-border and by allowing it to benefit from the breadth of the internal market. Secondly, the Commission is considering setting forth a proposal concerning the granting, amending, or removal of the substantial rights of access and use of data. This might be, so the Commission is considering issuing a data act covering those topics next year, but the proposal is not yet on the table. So I will just focus on point 1 in my presentation. So what are the data sharing intermediaries according to the proposal advanced by the Commission? They are undertakings which aim at putting into contact data holders and data users by providing legal support, technical support, or other kinds of support. They can connect businesses, they can connect consumers with businesses, they can take the form of data cooperatives. The definition is very broad. More interesting is to see what is left out of the scope of the regulation. That is intermediation between a limited number of data holders and data users. So cloud service providers are left out of the scope of the regulation, and intermediation that does not establish a direct relationship between data holders and data users. This is, for instance, the case of data brokers. Then there is a notification regime. So if an undertaking wishes to offer data intermediation services in the EU, it has to notify this intention to the national competent authority of the member state where its main establishment is. And upon a notification, it can start the business straight away. It must be established in the EU, or at least have a legal representative in the EU, and it may carry on its business everywhere in the EU. Regulatory requirements are also, the data sharing intermediaries are subject to, are also very interesting. The proposed regulation requires the neutrality as regards to the data exchange. This means that they cannot use the data they hold as data sharing intermediaries to carry out any other business activity. If they carry on a different business activity, there must be a structural segregation between such activity and the activity as data sharing intermediaries. Also, they must guarantee a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory access to their services to data holders and data users. So, what is the competition law issue that the data sharing intermediaries model and any model of data exchange might raise? The issue is that data sharing improves market transparency. Is that a good thing or a bad thing competition law-wise? Well, it depends. Increased transparency can be good in the sense that it enhances enhances efficiency. By allowing undertakings to better handle unstable demand, or by enabling consumer to switch provider at a lower cost. It even fixes some market failures in specific markets, such as the insurance markets. It can mitigate adverse selection and moral hazard problem. At the same time, transparency creates the good conditions for collusion. It can allow competitors to reach a collusion. It can reinforce a collusion. It can create an anti-competitive foreclosure vis-à-vis competitors which are out of the collusive agreement. And in this case, of course, data sharing leads to can be qualified as an infringement under Article 101 TFEU. So, there are 2 points I would like to make. First of all, as of today, it is much easier to verify whether an information exchange complies with EU law, with EU competition law, rather than verifying whether a data exchange complies with EU competition law. Why is that? Well, we have horizontal cooperation guidelines provided by the Commission, which specifically address the case of information exchanges, but do not address the case of data exchanges, which are data exchanges of information exchanges are very different because data is different from information. So data can be described as a factor of production in producing information. And this means that data is pooled or shared as soon as it is produced, that it is not selected. And in this way, we can say that data cannot per se intrinsically convey a business view or a business project. This does not mean, however, that data exchanges cannot be problematic by a competition law point of view. If a data exchange, for instance, is complemented by a technology, a common technology shared, models such as an AI tool, then the competitors sharing data are actually able to share information about their commercial strategy, and so competition law problems may arise. The second point that I would like to make is that the efficiency defense that is available to parties to an anti-competitive agreement under Article 101, paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union is very hard. It is very hard to, let's say, use for parties to a data exchange. Parties to an anti-competitive agreement willing to demonstrate that their agreement produces countervailing efficiencies which balance the anti-competitive effects of their agreements must first and foremost prove that their agreement creates the justice of the EU must qualify as appreciable objective advantages and cannot qualify as mere expectations. The problem is that in the case of data exchanges, the parties to the data exchange do not know which kind of innovation might arise from the exchange of data, and this makes the availability of the efficiency defense rather uncertain for parties to a data exchange. To conclude, I would like to highlight that the introduction of a harmonized framework for data sharing intermediaries is certainly a step forward towards improved business-to-business data sharing, but it must be complemented by efforts to improve legal certainty concerning the antitrust treatment of data shared data exchanges. So I would like to set forth two recommendations. The first of all is for the Commission to update the horizontal cooperation guidelines to address the problems, the competition law problems raised by data exchanges, but the Commission has already announced that it is willing to do so in a European strategy for data, in the communication European strategy for data. And secondly, I would recommend to the Commission to use notices of informal guidance in case of data exchanges, to provide, upon request of the parties to the exchange, tailored guidance as to the compliance of the data exchange with competition law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martina. I appreciate your presentation. Wonderful. And you can stay right with me. I also would like to ask the other speakers to maybe turn on their video. We'll be having our first short Q&A block for about 10 minutes, and Martina and Bernd will join me and provide some expert context for questions if need be. We've gotten already a few questions. I'll just be reading out some of those, and then Martina and Bernd, if you want to add to that or post them to a specific speaker, feel free to do so. Some questions are directly asked to one person, but if any of you would like to jump in, feel absolutely free to do so. One question was asked during Katarzyna, your talk, and it said, what could be done to increase the sustainability of the use of data, and how would you describe the situation around this topic within Europe?
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for this question. Yes, indeed, I think that there is a need to increase stress the importance of sustainability in the digital value chain, and this should be done with more inclusiveness. We have to include other categories of farms in the digital value chain, and to provide data products and services also for smaller farms and agroecological farms. And a lot of problems, I think that there is some problems result from the lack of understanding of digital agriculture. This concept is often boiled down to high-tech precision agriculture techniques, but digital agriculture also leads to improvements in other areas. Data can be used to improve human resource management, to improve risk management, for example, to improve management of natural resources. And I think data could not be reduced to high-tech precision data applied on large and very large farms. This future data space should also include other kinds of data, other types of data, to provide for possibilities for businesses to develop digital products and services for all categories of farms, including agroecological farms, including family farms, small farms, and others. And
excuse me, do you hear me?
yes.
Sean, yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
I guess you skipped my turn in presentations before.
According to my schedule, you're scheduled to give your presentation after the Q&A. I'm sorry if you've gotten other information. Yeah, no, we haven't forgotten you. No worries. You'll be up in 10 minutes.
Oh.
All right. Any other thoughts on Katarzyna's points?
And what was the second part of the question? Maybe I have not answered the whole question.
It's more general. How would you describe the situation around sustainability and the use of data within Europe?
As I already mentioned during my presentation, the information on the uptake of digital technologies and smart farming techniques is scarce, but we can expect that some countries are more advanced and other regions are more advanced than others. So there's a risk of growing inequalities between countries, regions, and farms in terms of the adoption of these technologies. And I think we should address this risk before adopting the rules and principles for the European agriculture data space. I think that there is a great risk to increase these inequalities and to reduce the chances for scaling up sustainable farming practices based on agriculture data.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question that I'm seeing here, it's addressed to you, Alexander, but might also be interesting for others. It says, Dr. Duisberg mentioned that it's all about contracts and that those needed to be balanced. Question, how does he think a pattern of T&Cs would be helpful?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. So I think there are two things to consider. First of all, yes, the ecosystem has to be based on contracts. And secondly, we do have and want and need to preserve freedom of contract. This is a precondition for any fair and balanced approach to markets, as well as also then considering whether there are structural disadvantages or stakeholders who might be structurally disadvantaged. And it was already mentioned that there might be a pending disadvantage of farmers. However, farmers also can obviously get organized through associations. So it's not like we're just looking at the individual farmer. Fair and balanced would mean that there is a reasonable quid pro quo and that there is clarity and transparency on contract terms at the level of data. It plays out in terms of transparency of usage of data. I think we see some interesting aspects in the Data Governance Act. I think there are some interesting principles laid out there which could give guidance. I think the bottom line would be, and this is, I think, also the past experience, including also at the EU level, for example, in the last, let's say, decade around cloud computing, it is not easy to really present viably, in a viable manner, fair and balanced contract terms which would work universally. So any kind of approach always has to stay, let's say, on the safe side of not being prescriptive and regulatory in terms of contract freedom. However, it can be very helpful if different stakeholders work on this in a joint manner. I will just add a very small example, which I have been looking at within the platform industry for Zero, where we have created a platform agreement for a so-called legal test bed, and we have brought together stakeholders from industry from different perspectives to create a platform contract. We were actually going to put this out under a Creative Commons license for everyone to look at and study. It shows it is not easy, and we also know by experience lawyers who are endorsed by their clients to represent different interests obviously need to negotiate contracts. But I think there is a role for institutions to bring out sample contracts, and in that sense, that could be very helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful, Alexander. Thank you very much. I know no more thoughts on this question. There's one question that has been addressed directly to you, Martina. Could also be interesting for all of you, maybe. It says, should intermediaries have the right to broker certain data exclusively?
Should intermediaries,
should intermediaries have the right to broker certain data exclusively?
To broker. But data brokerage is not covered by this regulation. So like the data intermediary is like it's a very broad concept. So I guess that there might be many kind of activities which might fall in this definition. But as far as I understood it, it is a mere facilitator. So it makes data holders and data users meet. And so like the concept of exclusivity for such an activity is a bit, plus he cannot use the data it holds in its capacity as a facilitator. So I think that there is no scope for that according to the regulation as proposed by the Commission. But I mean, it was proposed last week. Those are my thoughts. So maybe my co-panelists might have. What do you think, Alexander?
It's a great thought. I would like to say maybe the term of intermediary and broker overlap. I would also see room for brokers who actually make their business out of making available data. And obviously, if you have a monetization model behind, there's also an interest in return on investment, and possibly there are business models which do need to rely on added services in making available certain data. And in that sense, there could also be, let's say, a market justification that allows for exclusivity. I am a strong perpetrator of market freedom and freedom of contract. However, if you think about a platform which initially makes available freely the data between, if you like, data providers and data users, then it becomes a real challenge to see where the monetization model, so the agent, the broker, can actually work if he cannot define, let's say, market distinctive services. And there may be an element of exclusivity which he needs to provide in competition to other providers of data. So I would not outrule the potential for exclusivity, but it needs to be looked at ultimately also from an antitrust and competition perspective.
Well, the double activity as like intermediary and like the carrying out of some kind of other business should be structurally segregated according to the proposal. So there should be a different entity dealing with the non-intermediation business. So maybe segregation is also structural segregation is also something to be taken into consideration in this regard.
All right, I would propose to continue with our expert inputs, unless Bernd or Martina, you have some feeling that anything is still left open from our first Q&A. Good. We'll also have a bigger Q&A after the next two inputs, so then we can address more questions there. Also, reminder to our audience to keep asking questions. Just enter them into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can before the session will conclude. We'll now continue with our fourth input by Can Atik. He is a PhD candidate at Tilburg Law School at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and he will speak about data ownership, data sharing, and access rights. Can, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you see the presentation right now?
Yes, we can hear you. We see the presentation. Looks all good.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to speak about the discussions in the literature regarding regulatory intervention and the idea of providing data ownership right to farmers from the competition policy point of view. As you all know, smart farming brings about significant opportunities in favor of sustainable and cost-efficient farming practices. That's really important and promising for the entire world. However, there are also questions and concerns regarding the control of agricultural data sets. Although there can be a lot of concerns from different perspectives and disciplines, I will consider the discussions by centralizing the farmers' data-related lock-in problem. There are significant complaints that farmers do not have any control on the collected farm data sets. This causes lock-in situations because farmers are dependent on the goodwill of the first-mover agricultural technology providers when they desire to switch to a rival service provider together with their historical data sets. This is important from the competition perspective because if farmers are locked in, the first movers, new innovative competitors cannot gain customers, or in other words, farmers cannot easily switch to better or cheaper services. This increases entry barriers, reduces competition in this emerging sector, and that's bad for the innovation and development of the sector. There are two main reasons for this lock-in problem: legal ambiguity and lack of interoperability standards. First is related to the unclear picture of the applicable data rights in the agriculture sector. Most of the data is considered as non-personal sensor-generated data, so applicability of GDPR is highly questionable, especially its right to data portability here. Indeed, the non-personal nature of agricultural data is stated in the free flow of non-personal data regulation as well. This regulation offers voluntary sectoral governance initiatives instead of bringing binding rules, unlike GDPR. In the slide, we can see voluntary data governance initiatives in the US and EU. They both vest data ownership right to farmers as the legal foundation of their other connected rights. However, whether this really helps farmers or solves the data access problems in the sector, I will particularly discuss this point in this presentation. Also, there are discussions in the literature regarding whether data belongs to farmers, data collectors, if not farmers, technology providers, landowners, or even financial lenders. So who should have which rights? That's not clear in terms of broader allocation of rights. So apart from the appropriateness of giving ownership right to farmers, I will also discuss broader access rights in the sector. So if I come back to here to explain the second reason for the lock-in problem, that's the technical reasons, lack of interoperability standards. There are papers which state that this fragmentation of standards are sometimes intentionally designed by the companies to nudge farmers to buy entire system from the same company. So without solving interoperability problem, allocation of rights might not be sufficient enough to address sectoral problems, including the lock-in. There are additional elements we need to understand why lock-in problem can be concerning. Farmers do not have power to negotiate with technology providers to change terms and conditions. Unlike private data in online platforms, data does not necessarily lose value in time. Farmers need historical data sets to receive proper services from new tech providers. Competition law enforcement can be a solution here to a certain extent, but it might have limited effects as it has exposed characteristic and it is only enforceable for the particular case. So there is a need for sector-wide ex-ante solution. The question is, as I said, whether data ownership understanding can be helpful in this regard, and what other options can be there. Before analyzing the sectoral conditions, it might be helpful to have a quick look at the broader literature on data ownership for non-personal data. We can learn something from this general non-sector specific discussions. In 2017, the European Commission's communication mentioned data producers' rights and connected ownership of data and the ownership of the device. This ignited a discussion regarding whether this is a good idea. And there are divergent views, but I selected Drexel's arguments here. He basically says this is not a good idea. He emphasized 3 points. The intended function of such a right would fail, problems for third-party access due to the exclusive nature of the ownership concept, and ownership is open to violations that may open up additional legal conflicts. So he proposed data access rights according to the specific sector's needs. I agree with Drexel to a large extent, but I have also additional concerns regarding data ownership rights for the emerging digital agriculture sector. So in order to understand whether data ownership is an appropriate legal understanding for agricultural data, it's important to remember the components of the ownership as a legal concept since the Roman law. Owner of a property has right to use, right to encumber or transfer the good, right to the fruits, usus, abusus, and fructus. So the delicate point is here is related to the abusus element. Even though a regulation gives the data ownership right to farmers originally, this can be sold to other parties, and basic economic theory says that a good ends up in the hands of those who attach the most value to that good. So in our sector, integrated technology providers have more incentives to control the data sets, both to train their algorithms and to lock the existing users inside. So these rights can be legally transferred to the technology provider companies later on. This only renders the de facto data control into legally recognized one. So this cannot solve farmers' lock-in problem and change status quo. More importantly, it may even deteriorate farmers' lock-in situations because de facto control may become legally recognized right of data ownership held by the companies. It is important to keep in mind that some sectoral conditions when considering this possibility. These conditions increase the risk of legally valid lock-ins. First is related to the technology providers that have standard take it or leave it terms and conditions which may not be changed by the farmers. So a clause that states legal transfer of ownership rights might be a possibility for the companies in the beginning of their relationship with the farmers. So maybe it can be argued that these terms might not be valid because of the standardized terms and contracts clauses in the continental European contract laws. But this can only be a valid ex post and case-by-case solution. So this cannot solve the de facto and legal control claims of the companies. Second point is the company's lack of incentive to transfer the data sets to rivals. So they may enforce their right to encumber when farmers request transfer if they hold the ownership right later on, of course. There are also complaints that terms and conditions are highly one-sided in favor of the technology providers. So it would not be surprising that tech providers put transfer of ownership right clauses in their terms. So to recap, for digital agriculture sector, ownership right is not able to change the status quo, but could even make farmers more dependent on technology providers. Also, it does not have any solution to interoperability problem. Therefore, the regulatory intervention should be more sophisticated than just providing ownership right for farmers. So in my view, there are three options to solve farmers' lock-in problem. First is a refined voluntary data governance regime. Free flow of non-personal data regulation proposed voluntary governance regime and EU Code of Conduct attempts to generate rules. However, as we have discussed with Dr. Bertin Martens in our paper, and another paper, there are problems in the voluntary data rules in the EU and US, apart from their problematic data ownership understanding. They do not force participants to follow the proposed rules. This is the most important problem, I think. There are repetitive clauses that put contractual freedom over the rules. So, for instance, you can see here, within the context of the agreement emphasis or unless otherwise agreed in the contract emphasis. So even if these are clauses of a binding regulation, they are unlikely to solve lock-in problem in the sector, I think. So, however, I have to note that the Australian Farm Data Code is not like that. If you participate in the voluntary data governance regime, you have to follow the rules inside. However, problem of this initiative is the provision under portability is more related to data retrieval right or right to be forgotten instead of the portability right. So there is no, for instance, in here, there is no clear obligation for tech providers to directly transfer data to rivals. So design of the code is better, but the rule of the design of the rule is not, of course, sufficient here. So I believe that voluntary initiatives can only be helpful if their design is binding for participants, if there is wide participation by the stakeholders, and more importantly, if their clauses is well designed according to the sectoral needs. Another option is a binding and mandatory data portability regulation applicable to non-personal farm data. The same concern regarding design of the portability rule in terms of its scope is also valid here. The rule should be carefully designed to respond to all the data transfer needs of the farmers. Another important point is that a possible regulatory intervention should have binding of interoperability obligations in line with the portability right design. This intervention can solve the lock-in problem of farmers, I think, but it is not able to solve all the data access problems in the sector. In this point, I think Professor Pop and others' agribusiness collaboration and data exchange facility suggestion, and this idea in general might be valuable. If there is a data access hub or pool is designed with particular data access rules for each legitimate stakeholder, that may increase the free flow of data in the sector and can increase the innovation and developments based on an optimal exploitation of data. However, determining these access rules and allocate access rights is not an easy task and not in the scope of the study right now. Maybe there is a need for an additional study for that. So to sum up, alienable ownership rights can be transferred to third parties, and farmers may lose their control on data permanently. This can be more serious risk when considering farmers' weaker position vis-a-vis companies and their standard terms and conditions. This design would only turn technology providers' de facto control over data into the de jure situation. Therefore, it can be argued that binding and inalienable sui generis rights can be designed to address specific market failures in the sector instead of using ownership concept or transplantation of GDPR concepts to agriculture sector. Multiple stakeholders might use data instead of exclusive structure of ownership understanding. This might be more compatible with non-rivalry of data. So apart from better designed voluntary governance options, we have two ways out, I think. First, we need to have binding and well-designed data portability right and interoperability standards applicable in the sector. This may help solve farmers' lock-in problem, however, it does not solve a broader access problem of other stakeholders. So having central data access hub with well-designed access rights for the stakeholders can be a broader solution for the sector. Having a central hub can maximize the economies of scale and scope enabled by data. However, as I said, allocation of access rights within the central hub is not an easy task. I need to say something else for the exclusive rights that limit others' access to data, such as consent, data retrieval, purpose, or storage limitations. As in the US and EU data charters, they use these rights in their voluntary rules. It is important to note that they are more related to the privacy of individuals, so their application to non-personal data setting need to be considered carefully. Balancing the benefits and costs might be important here. They may increase the bargaining power of the right holders, but they definitely affect third-party data access detrimentally with their additional condition of consent. Thank you very much.
Sean, thank you so much. This was quite the interesting presentation. I particularly appreciate that you, I guess, compared regulations in the European Union with the situation in other countries. Quite interesting. Also, thank you for providing concrete solutions. Yes, wonderful. We will continue with our fifth speaker and actually the last speaker on track 2 this afternoon. That is going to be Bernd Rauch. He is a project manager at the Department of Architecture-Centric Engineering at Fraunhofer Institute for Experimental Software Engineering, IESE. And he will address data sovereignty in agriculture, status quo, challenges, and solution concepts. The floor is yours, Bernd. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vincent. Do you see my presentation and can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, and I can see your presentation as well. So you look all good to go.
Okay, so thank you so far for the presentations we've seen today, and I've noticed some kind of redundancy, I have to say, which is a good thing in this scenario, because we all think about the same aspects and we all identify the same challenges. So I think speaking about things multiple times from different perspectives can really help us in the process of digital transformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about data sovereignty in agriculture. We are currently conducting as Fraunhofer a big research project in digital agriculture, and data sovereignty is one of our major aspects here. Let me start and I can switch. Okay, what's this talk about? As I said, data sovereignty is an essential factor from our perspective for digital transformation. Today, we've seen several presentations that marked or stressed out how data is vital for digitization and new innovative business model and services that can be designed for agriculture in the future. But there are many challenges to solve until we reach that point. I give a short overview of a digital ecosystem from our perspective, what we've seen so far in our research. And in the end, I want to talk about the overall requirements of solution concepts, or for solution concepts. It's not so much about single solution concepts. It's more like how could we implement solution concepts in the market with respect to a governance framework. So data sovereignty is a key requirement. It is important for farmers. We've seen it in several project contexts. We've found it in questionnaires online. And we talked a lot to farmers, and we just know they require it. They are very, or rather reluctant to share their data. And it is an important issue for the farmers especially. But it's not important only for farmers. There are other stakeholders as well. So a manufacturer sells machines, but the machine generates not only data relevant for the farmers, but also relevant for the manufacturer. And this is an interesting and important aspect as well. Without data sovereignty, we fear there is no willingness to share data. And this could hamper digitization and digital transformation of the agriculture in general. We've talked a lot about data sovereignty today. Other presentations did this as well, but the question is, what is data sovereignty in detail? There is no comprehensive definition yet from our perspective. So we've seen some definitions. They are not too detailed or not tailored for a specific market. And it always depends on the different perspectives. So we've talked to a lot of stakeholders from the from agriculture, and every stakeholder had a slightly different understanding of what data sovereignty means. So from our research project, we propose a definition. There are three major aspects. It's no data use by third parties without the consent of the respective owner. And I've marked owner here. I'm coming back to that later. Which also includes the revocation of consent. So you give consent for usage of your data, but you should have the possibility to revoke that consent later on. Transparency is very, very important. We heard this today several times, that it's not only that you have control, some kind of control over your data, it's moreover that you can check or monitor what's going on with your data. And the last one is that we've also heard that today, that you should have the possibility to flexibly use your own data so that you can use data generated in system A in another system as well. Those are the three major aspects for data sovereignty for our perspective. So if partners agree, yes, I give you data sovereignty and you have full data sovereignty, that might be a start, but it's not everything because it doesn't explain everything. So if we look at a typical scenario in agricultural value networks, there is some kind of data generation from production resources. Okay, you have a field, animals or whatever, and imagine you have a process where you harvest the crops from your field and you have a certain yield amount and so on, and other sensoric values, and this all those processes all generate some kind of data. We talked a lot about data, and I marked it here as well because it's not only this data. First of all, different stakeholders have different expectations from data. In the center is the farmer. In this scenario here is the farmer himself. So he wants to use the data for farming processes, for benchmarks or whatever, or subsequent following processes. There's something like a family or a consumer who wants to make sure that food is healthy or hygienic. So they want to monitor the chain, the production chain back to the field and to know whether it's organic or not. You have the industry, which wants to use the data to develop future technologies and services. You have authorities who want to use the data to monitor compliance with the law, and maybe you even have the society as in general who want to ensure that the production process is sustainable. So there are many, many more expectations from different stakeholders, but it's important to see that it's not only data that it's used by some data consumer. There are many, many data consumers with different expectations. Next problem is it's not only data, it's a lot of different data. So we have like economical data, like the yield from a harvest, or livestock data, the health monitoring for your livestock, or you have your operational data of your respective farm, which somehow is owned, whatever that means, by the farmer. Then you have, I mentioned it in the beginning, machine data. When a machine operates on a field, it generates a lot of data. Not all of that data is directly connected to the economical data here, but it's like fuel consumption and so on, which might be only used by the manufacturer, but it's generated in the context of the farmer. So who does this data belong to? And lastly, you have the contractor who might operating on the machine on the field of the farmer, and he has again work or service operator data, and he wants to have data sovereignty on this specific part of the data. So that makes it even more complicated. If you talk about sharing data at this point, it's not only the data, it's a lot of different data. The next challenge is in the ecosystem today, you use different systems for different solutions or processes. We have this same picture here. We have the basic resources at the lower level, then you have sensors and machines, and all those entities generate data and store it in different systems. You might have an FMIS, a farm management information system A, at a parameter of the farm itself. Then you might have another FMIS in the cloud as a cloud service. Then you have a machine from manufacturer C and a machine from manufacturer D, and in the end, your data is distributed among different systems, which is not generally a problem, but it will makes the question of data sovereignty. If you imagine you have a lot of data in each of those databases, makes it very complicated. And the last thing is, okay, data sovereignty means more than granting access to data. So one-time access, okay, I copy the data, you can copy it to your site, and that's it. If a farmer agrees, okay, I grant you access to my data for offering services to me, but nothing more, then this data is transported to the site of the company who's offering those services. So how about revoking the data once it was copied? It is here at this place. If you have a code of conduct, then it's fine, but you have to trust that this company is complying to the code of conduct. And what if I only want to share parts of my data or anonymize it? Do I have some kind of mechanisms here in this transportation process to manipulate what kind of data is shared with this with the company? And lastly, just 3 examples. And how would you ensure that the data I transfer to here is only used for the purposes we originally agreed upon? So this again is another challenge in the complex thing of data sovereignty. It's not the last slide, but it's consequences. To sum up in the middle of the presentation, we have a lot of diverse data from different agricultural processes. We have a multitude of stakeholders, each with their own interests in other data, and each with their own respective requirements towards their data sovereignty concerning their own data. We have technological ecosystem with distributed systems that doesn't make it easier. And we have not yet a technological framework to fully enable data sovereignty in agriculture. We've here to talk about international data spaces by Alexander, which was really a good talk. And of course, since I'm working for Fraunhofer, I know the IDS, International Data Space, very well, but it's not implemented yet in agriculture. It could be a possible solution. And so I come to the challenges. Besides a lack of interoperability, media breaks, and no comprehensive data exchange, we have to make sure, or we have to find a solution how to ensure data sovereignty in such a complex setting for farmers. And it needs to be easy understandable, because that's one of the major challenges we found, that farmers, it's not that they cannot understand the solutions, that's not their main business. They are farmers, and they should continue working as farmers and not as IT guys who understand how data is transformed and copied and stored at other places. So let me talk about the solution space. We've seen some solution ideas from the legal scope today. At least in Germany, I'm not no expert on this, but I read the paper, and so I can say at least in Germany, there is no legal ownership data, and as Alexander already pointed out, you may not want to have any, because it has other implications that could hamper data economies. And so you can build on contracts between legal entities, so like terms and conditions of between farmers and suppliers and so on, code of conduct, that's all fine, but it's very, very demanding for farmers. As I said before, they are farmers and they are no legal experts, they are no IT experts, they should focus on farming. On the other side, we have technological scope. We can we have several activities addressing data sovereignty as a core concept. There's Gaia X, the international data space we talked about, and the Lighthouse, our Lighthouse project, Cognitive Agriculture, where we are working on. Technology can provide data sovereignty, but it needs a common ground. That's where governmental governance frameworks can come in. Let me talk about an exemplary solution concept. That's something we are working on, a digital twin for agriculture. You encapsulate all the data of a physical asset in a digital twin, which is a virtual representation of the real thing. So you make a virtual copy of a field, for example. Then the owner of the physical asset, which is the farmer of the field, is the owner of the field, has control over the digital twin. So you make something like an entity that that resembles the real asset, and you handle this entity like the real asset. So that could make it more easy to cope with questions: who is the owner of the data? Because the owner of the data is the owner of the field twin, who is the owner of the physical entity. So as a benefit, you could have consolidation of data and authorization in one place. You could implement the mechanisms for data sovereignty in the object. They enable a comprehensive data exchange in industry, and you could even decouple the data from the originating systems or services and make the data more portable. So in the scenario, typical scenario, a farmer could configure usage policies: who is eligible to use my data for what purpose, and those usage policies are then applied to concrete usages. If you talk about the solution, you see data sovereignty is one aspect of the digital transformation in agriculture. It's key. A concept like a digital twin is one possible building block for data sovereignty. How would you now implement one single building block in a huge and complex ecosystem with its diverse value network? That's the task we are facing. So a solution concept needs, from our perspective, a holistic approach. There's no single aspect you can focus on. You have to combine everything. You cannot talk about only on governance framework, legal aspects. You also have to talk about technology and align everything together. And in contrarily, you need to align the technology as well to legal aspects, of course. And one thing we've learned: talk to farmers and take farmers' perspective. That's one of the most important aspects from our side. So I come to conclusion. In the status quo, we have a highly complex technological ecosystem in huge value networks and the need for data sovereignty. Data is vital for digital transformation. I think we agree upon this now. And a stakeholder trust in digitization is essential for data sharing. No data sharing, no data economy. And there are already many activities to address those challenges, but they require a more holistic coordination, as do the solution concept. So we see a lot of activities and we are engaged in a lot of activities, but we still see a lack in the combination of everything to a single solution space. If you talk about European data spaces, you should talk about holistic coordination and holistic solution concept. Yeah, as I said, it's not about single aspect, it's about the combination of the aspects. That's it from our side. If you want, check out our work, and feel free to contact us if you are interested in getting engaged with our research. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernd. Appreciate your presentation and this overview. Very, very interesting. This is also bringing us to the last part of the session, the last part of track 2 today, actually, which is a Q&A. We've been collecting some more questions. Maybe if all of you speakers could turn on your camera again, that would be fantastic. We've gotten at least a couple more questions, particularly for our last two speakers, Can and Bernd. Maybe this is a good point to start. As before, I would like to specifically bring in Martina and Bernd to maybe contextualize some of the questions or take them or kind of develop them further if need be. Let me just pose one here that was addressed to Can. It says, could the farmers' associations or the government take a role in avoiding lock-in models? And what could this look like? Question for you, Can.
Yeah, for the second part, the governments can have a role with regulation. That's one of the options that I've mentioned. Also, cooperations of farmers might be, might be a solution. But there is a problem in this, because the problem is lock-in. And if the cooperation enter into agreement with the technology providers in the names of farmers, this may create, I think, another set of switching costs for farmers when they are not happy about the existing services, because there may be a kind of cooperation obligations for the member farmers. So I'm cautious about that option as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Again, all of you are very welcome to jump in at any time. Just feel free to do so, or raise your hand, or just unmute yourself. It's absolutely fine. In the meantime, I'll continue with a question for you, Bernd, and maybe also interesting for others. It's a very specific question, actually. How can a contract between two parties be binding for a third party, or for third parties more generally?
Is that to me?
Okay, so I'm a little bit astonished that yeah, maybe because I'm not an expert for contracts.
And maybe that's also a question that would be interesting for Can, you, or Alexander, maybe, or Martina, the law experts. I'm not sure.
I'm happy to give it a first stab. Of course, contracts are only valid between the parties who conclude the contract. However, it is obviously one way of addressing the issue, in particular where you're looking at data spaces or also platforms that you define terms of use, which are then contracts to which any participant adheres and joins, accepting those terms of use or terms and conditions. And by that, you can also have multilateral agreements, or at least each participant entering into a valid contract with other participants, or at least with the platform operator.
I may add something else. As far as I remember, EU code has some provisions regarding this. If the technology provider share data with the third party, the technology provider has to enter into agreement with this third party with the same conditions of the farmer's contract. But still, this is not legally enforceable by the farmer, because farmer will not be a part of this second contract. So I just wanted to note this as well.
I would just like to highlight that radical answer to this is the establishment of ownership right on data, of course. But this solution doesn't seem very popular here, and there are actually many contra, in the sense that, and also I do not know, I'm not aware of any real evidence of the fact that people in the industry actually feel like it's something important for them, or there's not really evidence that it might improve data sharing. And this is particularly bad because it can be considered a very strong form of public intervention on the economy. So it should have a reinforced justification, if you want, which is not present, at least in my opinion.
Right. Any more thoughts on that? Otherwise, I have a kind of an interesting question here for you, Bernd. It says, what if the digital twin of a machine owned by a contractor works on a digital twin of a field? How does the data ownership change, or is that the same in this kind of discussion or scenario?
Well, we don't have a data ownership. That's the point. But the question is, what kind of data is stored in the respective digital twin? So if you operate on an it's always the physical assets that are doing some processes, and the physical machine is working on the physical field. Then there's data generated from the machine, okay, but you have to differentiate this kind of data. Part of the data is connected to the field. Then this data should be moved to the field and live in the digital twin of the field. The other data can remain in the machine, in the digital twin of the machine. So that's an important factor. If you don't start with an early separation of the data differentiated by the physical asset it belongs to, then you will have a data mess, or you don't have an overview of your data, and you will have a hard time figuring out who's the owner of what and so on. That's the idea of digital twin. You encapsulate the data that's relevant to the physical asset. At best, at the very earliest process steps when the data is generated.
Maybe just an additional point I wanted to throw in here. One participant says, are we aware that in a lot of cases, farmers are obliged to share data, like animal health data and so on? So they are not always in full control of their own data. Just this more a comment rather than a question, I guess.
Yeah, and to give context to that, it's like you have, again, to differentiate who uses this data or with whom this data is shared. So if it's about animal health care, a lot of data is already shared with authorities, which are farmers obliged to do so, and which is okay because it has a legal base. There are databases that track, for example, the movement of animals to monitor for it's originated in the BSE crisis, so that you know when a cow crosses the border or whatever, or changes the owner. And other data is obliged to, like, how much fertilizer do you use on your field, is also farmers are obliged to share it with authorities on request. But also, or another aspect for this discussion is, if you buy a machine, then the terms and conditions often say, okay, you can use those digital services of this machine, but on the other side, you are obliged to share a specific set of data with us. I'm no expert on the terms and conditions for all manufacturers, but we heard occasions where this was part of the terms and conditions. And if you talk to farmers and they say, okay, if I'm going to invest into a machine, I don't have time. I have so many things to think about, and I have to have a big investment. I don't have the time to study the terms and conditions, to check everything, every legal aspect in it, which could result in an obligation to share data with the supplier. That those aspects are two aspects only, and you could have more, yes, but we are aware of that.
I'd also like to add two points. I think, Bernd, what you've said is very valid and true, and also the point about terms and conditions might draw to the conclusion that there should also be some involvement maybe of farmers associations of discussing those terms and conditions also with the vendors, because it is obvious that the individual farmer doesn't have the time nor the bargaining power to have a legal discussion. I would also like to add on the point about sharing data two more aspects. We've seen that very often also, that there are consortia. You could take, for example, the sugar industry, which is a very concrete example I've seen, where the growers obviously are organized through consortia and where they also share the data. And one point that was made is very important, or 2 points I'd like to make. I would like to put into perspective what John said. We came to the conclusion that there is personal data, and GDPR does apply, because you do have the association with the name of the farmer. So in many sharing situations, you do have GDPR, and you do have also portability rights and all of that. The other point is also that when you're sharing data in consortia, you have very, very complex GDPR or also non-GDPR situations. The point that comes out again and again is that the farmers obviously have a very long-term perspective. They are on their land maybe for decades, maybe it's family-owned farms. And part of the value that comes out of the fields, which they are very, very keen about, is actually the quality of the soil, the weather conditions, the optimization of how they grow their crop and how they harvest and all of this. Some of the business models are onto that. And the intrinsic value of the long-term perspective of how this data is built up actually ties, from my perspective, into what Katarzyna says at the beginning. You do have a disparity of the market because you actually need to build up that track record. You really want to know how good your field is doing over the last 30 years. Farmers know this by intuition, and you want to become more scientific about this to optimize the productivity of the field and so forth. And I think that's one of the big challenges of how you develop that. And it does require a joint effort, a concerted effort, because obviously the individual farmer cannot make that investment on his own. Right now, he's doing it by his intuition, his feeling for the soil. If you want to become more scientific, you have a further investment, and it does require actually sharing that data and building the right incentives. And I think the growers associations, they have a role to play that also needs to be addressed. So it's not just regulation, but it's also creating the right incentives of bringing everyone into the ecosystem. Thank you.
Katarzyna, I'm just curious if you would like to add on that.
Yes, I totally agree with Alexander. We need to create an ecosystem involving different stakeholders, farmers who cooperate with IT companies, data analytics companies. The ecosystem should include also researchers specializing in sustainability modeling. So yes, this process is quite time demanding and costly. And I also agree that economic incentivization is needed to create such data products and services, and to persuade farmers and other stakeholders to share agricultural data for innovation in agriculture. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I have another question. Sean, maybe this is for you, but I think this is a very interesting one for all of you. It says, assuming that the economic value of data is more created by data companies rather than the farmers, could too much protection of those hinder innovation? So I guess a little bit more broadly, is too much protection an enemy of innovation? Maybe, Chan, you want to take a first jab at that, but all others, of course, you are very welcome to jump in.
Yes, as I mentioned in the end of my presentation regarding the consent-based rights or other rules regarding purpose or storage limitations, these kind of rules are valid in both EU and US voluntary charters, but it is obvious that they are legal transplantations from the GDPR. And I'm not sure whether these kind of privacy-related rules are also needed in the non-personal data setting. Of course, if we give these kind of rights to farmers, we may increase their bargaining power, because third-party data access seekers need to have the consent of farmers. So farmers have the power to data flow decisions. However, on the other hand, as I said, we create another set of barrier before the free flow of data in the sector. So policymakers should be very careful to balance these kind of objectives. I believe that farmers' bargaining position need to be increased, but I don't know whether it is appropriate decision by giving these rights to them or finding other solutions.
So we're doing a lot of research on digital ecosystems, and we know data is vital for ecosystems. It's a data economy, and a lot of business models and innovation is based on it. I would propose not to talk about protection of the farmers. It's more about enabling them to be a partner in a fair data economy, helping them to make their data towards a product, to develop the data. And of course, a lot of value is generated by corporations who create innovation from this this data, but of course the farmer delivers the data. It's like the farmer delivers the grain which is produced into bread, and there is an increase of value at each step, and that's what we need to data. I mean, the concepts are known. The problem are the processes. How do we monitorize data, and how do we make sure that the process of data usage is ensured by technological means and by governance means.
All right. There's a question that kind of maybe adds a little bit to that in a similar direction. It says, is it the role of the government to support small players? If they lack time or interest to read the contracts, this is not done in other businesses, is it?
Well, it's done in consumer protection, right? You have those information, European information, how do they call it? Pages where you can see how your mobile contract and what's the base aspects of your mobile contract. Why couldn't I heard in discussions this argument, why couldn't you have something like that for farmers as well? Then the counter argument is farmers are businessmen, they are professional entities, and they should be aware of what's behind terms and conditions. I personally think that the truth is something in the middle, and governmental or authorities could help the process in forming a Mustervertrag, maybe someone can help me with the legal expertise.
I can say something from the competition law perspective. I mean, regarding the protecting the smaller players. If we mention about smaller agricultural technology providers to compete with big integrated ones, normally the competition law doesn't protect the rivals. It only ensures the competitive environment. But if we speak about farmers, we have a common agricultural policy and other specific sector-specific rules. So, I mean, that's a kind of policy question, but I think farmers needs to be protected within this general policy perspective.
Maybe I would like to add, I agree that we have this policy level instruments, the common agriculture policy, but currently this common agriculture policy does not include measures that would support small-scale farmers in digitalization. We are planning such instruments and measures, but still the major instrument of the common agriculture policy, direct payments, supports the largest and the wealthiest farms, the well-situated farms. And in fact, we can argue that somehow these policy instruments, economic instruments, contribute to somehow to digital divides in European farming systems. So we have to think about more appropriate tools to support more inclusive digital transformation in agriculture. Maybe it is time to think about more fundamental reform of the direct payments to somehow link direct payments with agriculture data, because the agriculture data is a kind of new commodity, and maybe it's time to think about this change, just to link these payments, to incentivize farmers to collect agriculture data, to share agriculture data with others.
If I may add, so I thought that the topic was not whether it is appropriate to protect small actors, but more about convincing small actors to put their data to use, and that there are substantial societal gains which can be obtained from this. So it's not about protecting them, but like finding ways for them to solve this trust problem that they have, and which prompts them to withhold their data. Because I think that we might all agree that industrial advancement depends upon people being more willing to share their data. And there are even some programs of the Commission, the Farm to Fork initiative and all this kind of stuff, which is linked somehow to more data being provided, more data being put to use. So I think that we can all agree that it is everybody's interest to convince them to do so.
Alexander, did you also want to add on that?
Well, thank you. I think much has been said. I'm also not an advocate of replacing the, let's say, freedom of contract and the sovereignty of parties of entering into proper agreements. I think it is absolutely true what Martina says, that it is about creating incentives and motivation. My observation are considering, if you like, more conservative industries, and I would consider the farming industry, including their farmers' associations, in some parts as rather conservative. In other parts, they have, a cutting-edge technology at hand. At least, arguably, the larger farmers, the ones who have more means for doing so. I still think it is important to give everyone a helping hand, and I would see a significant role indeed in the, if you like, farmer associations to have the dialogue with the large vendors of technology and say, well, you will have market success if your terms and conditions are suitable and palatable, and take off the burden and allow us as a farmers association also to endorse it with a positive recommendation. I think that's also a very important part in the ecosystem, because there's always a risk in just jumping for regulation first place and say this will solve everything. I think the dynamics of the market are such that regulation typically steps in a bit late and doesn't anticipate the dynamics of the market and also the technological evolution. So I would see that level of encouragement as very relevant. And to bring it out quite dynamically. And it was also mentioned previously, all of this is good and nicely said, but we also need to acknowledge, and this is where I'd see a role of government, if we don't have a broadband access in rural areas, this is all a very academic discussion. And this is a role where government needs to really get involved, because otherwise we will just leave many, many places out of this development. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alexander. With one eye on the time, I'm proposing to start to wrap things up here. I would like, if you will, to give all of you the opportunity for short final remarks. I would suggest maybe something of, or I would be curious, maybe what is the biggest insight you have gained from this discussion, and maybe where are you planning on, or what are you planning on doing next? Where are your projects and your research is? Where is your work leading you? So maybe briefly, I don't know, a few sentences for each of you, if you want to just share your concluding thoughts for this session. Whoever would like to go first, just go for it.
Okay, maybe I will start because I was first. The most important conclusion is that we have great opportunities because of digitalization in agriculture, but we also have many regulatory challenges, and these challenges are really, really difficult, legal challenges especially. This is great that the European Commission works on the European agriculture data space, and it's great that we today had an opportunity to discuss rules and principles for this digital agriculture and for the future. And my future research plans relate to sustainable digital agriculture. I would like to conduct research on the adoption of digital technologies by smaller farms, different farms in Poland and in other regions in Europe.
All right.
Well, I
Who
don't
would
know
like
if
to
we're
go
going,
next?
if we're going
Please,
sequence.
Alexander.
It's very often the lawyer is the last one in the room to talk. So, but I'll do it first or second. So, no, I would like to thank everyone for the fantastic level of discussion. I think this has been for me personally just very enriching. I would say that there is a vast opportunity. There is a need for a concerted effort. I think the role of the data space concept is imminent. It does involve bringing the right people to the table. So the various stakeholders, the technology vendors, the data intermediaries, the farmer associations. It is a big challenge because in Europe, we obviously have a diversified by nature, geographically spread landscape of agriculture and farming business at different levels of maturity. However, if we're able to develop role models that work and are powerful and include obviously broadband access, this is actually a very, very significant part of also the sustainable growth of agricultural business in Europe, and it would have a huge lead role also beyond Europe. I think this is the great opportunity, and I do appeal to the European Commission to take that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Martina, maybe if we go in order of presentation.
Well, I would also like to thank the organizer for having given me the opportunity to be part of this very interesting panel. I think that, like, for me, it has been an opportunity to get to know this sector, which I'm not particularly familiar with. And it sounds like there's going to be developments very soon in our topic. So I will no doubt follow such developments closely. Thanks to all those who presented their views, introduced their views on the subject today.
I also thank you very much for the organizers and also all the participants that I've learned a lot. I have to maybe recap with my points. I think we should avoid data ownership concept if we regulate data in this sector. Instead, multiple data access rights should be carefully considered. For that reason, I think the future research should focus on how to allocate those rights because there are plenty of stakeholders in the sector, and the maximum exploitation of data is very important to sector developments, innovation, and for the farmers and all the society. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Can. And Bernd, your last words to wrap this up.
So this time the IT guy is the last one to talk, not the lawyer. Today I learned a lot of new ideas and insights from different perspectives, I have to admit, because we did it or we did our research mostly from a technological perspective, and today we got a lot of insights in governance and legal perspective, which is really a benefit from my side. On the other side, it adds some more stakeholders and perspectives in this already highly complex situation we have at agriculture. We have really diverse stakeholders, and as Alexander pointed out, we need to bring them all together at the table to find a common solution. And I think a conference like this we had today, and it goes on tomorrow, is highly valuable in this process. So thank you for enabling this conference and inviting me as well. And let me conclude with what I heard last week in a talk in a Bitkom conference. I just switched into one talk, and there was one woman saying that in Europe we have a problem because other nations, continents like United States or Asia, they are building up data economies, and they are very eager to do so. They have advantages on multiple levels, and they have less regulation, which enables a better data economy. They have already models how to trade data. And the GDPR would hamper the European Union to do so. I see a chance in this one, because with the GDPR, we can find a model that builds up a fair data space for all, and not only for big companies. And so the possible how to say flaw in with the GDPR and data economy could in the end be a benefit and an advantage for the European Union, and we should really follow this path and work on a fair data economy for Europe, which could be a role model for the whole world. Thank you.
Those are great concluding thoughts, Bernd. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I really appreciate the 5 of you being here, sharing your thoughts, your perspectives, your expertise, really. Yes, and also, of course, fingers crossed, best wishes for your future endeavors. It's very important, and I think all of you have remarked there's quite a lot of, I guess, change or momentum in this field. So I'm sure it's going to be very interesting to, in regards to everything that comes next for you as well. One remark to our audience, or at least a couple of you have asked whether this conference will be recorded. Yes, it is going to be, or is being recorded, and will be made available for participants at some point. I don't know exactly when and in what format that will be, but you will be informed once that is available. So just for you to know. And with that, we're really coming to an end of today's schedule overall. I really appreciate all the questions, all the participants being part of the comments, or just viewing and being part of this discussion online. And we're looking forward to welcoming you back here tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the second day of our conference. We'll start off tomorrow morning with the discussion forum on track 1. We'll also host a closed-door discussion for policymakers from both member states and the European Commission in a roundtable discussion. The afternoon will feature a panel discussion bringing together top-level speakers before wrapping up the conference with concluding remarks by experts from the Ministry and EURAGRI. If you would like to check out both their websites, the Federal German Ministry of Food and Agriculture, as well as EURAGRI, feel free to do so. And with that being said, I wish all of you a very good evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Thank you so much.